Hello again, this is Joe Roberts with a continuation of my tutorials on the Tekkit pack and SGTekkit in particular. If you watched my last video, you'll notice that I expanded the machine by a significant margin. Instead of one slave pen, I now have 4. Instead of 5 singularity compressors, I now have 20. This is producing a lot of ice. Useful if you have like a massive setup with like 10, 15, 20 HV solars, but you're not going to have that for a very long time. This tutorial is actually intended for people who don't have that setup. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on one very good way of generating power similar to multiple HVs with a very low resource input, actually. What I'm talking about is nuclear reactors. Now, Joe, you might say, I've looked at all the tutorials online for nuclear reactors. Making a safe reactor, I want to make a safe reactor, is really hard. It's super expensive, lots of integrated reactor plating and stupid stuff like that, and it only outputs like 200, 300 EU per tick. No. We're not going to make a safe and boring nuclear reactor. We're going to make an unsafe nuclear reactor. We are going to make a manly nuclear reactor. Now, a little bit of a primer on how nuclear reactors work. Let me just use a chest to illustrate. Imagine that this is a reactor. It's not, I know, but just imagine that it is. So normally how reactors work is that if you put a single cell in it, that cell pulses once per tick, producing 10 EU for that specific pulse. If you put in a second uranium cell, it'll pulse another once, so this setup right here will give you 20. However, if you put the uranium cells right next to each other, then they are going to pulse once for themselves and then once for each other. So this setup here is going to pulse 4 times for a total of 40 EU per tick. If you add in more uranium cells, then these all pulse once for themselves and then twice for the ones right next to them, for a total of 3 per cell, so 120 EU per tick. Now, what we are going to do is we are going to be manly. Boom. Here we go. This is the reactor that we are aiming to build. We are going to make a manly reactor that its entire purpose is going to be creating a lot of energy. Now, Joe, you might say, if I put this in my reactor, it's going to blow up in about 20 seconds and take out the entire building with it. Yes, exactly. Which is why we're going to do what we have already done. We are just going to stuff it full of ice. And the more ice that's in this thing, the more ice evaporates, the cooler the reactor is going to be. So even with all of these uranium cells, even if you fill the entire damn thing up with uranium cells, as long as you have ice in there, it's going to still remain at 0 heat. It's going to be completely and totally safe. And what do we have? We have a machine that makes about 10 ice, no, a machine that makes about 20 ice per second, which is enough to take out, I think, 4,000 heat from a reactor. That's, considering that the maximum heat threshold of a reactor is 1200, give or take, yeah, we're gonna be pretty well set up. So what we want to do is we still want to be safe about it. So we're going to do the same basic setup of any reactor. Effectively reinforced stone, 7 long. Excuse me. And then build this whole thing, yada. I'll be right back once I've built it. And I'm back. So I've done the boring thing and laid down that 7x7 block. Now what you want to do is you want to build a reactor. Now excuse me for being in creative mode, but basically what you want to do with this is 1 nuclear reactor in the center, and then 6 reactor chambers around the side. You can find the recipes pretty simply, it's relatively simple to do. And then you're going to continue building the little safe thing around the outside. Excuse me. Making sure that there is actually a hole that you can reach through in the reactor, in each side of the reactor. Now, if you're not playing on SGTekkit, that hole is where the explosion is going to go if there is going to be an explosion. So be careful not to have anything important in the way. Like, this is bad because my solars are in the way of this explosion, and if I wasn't on SGTekkit, then that's going to blow out that way and take out like a huge part of the countryside. But on SGTekkit, explosions are heavily nerfed, so you don't really need to worry about it doing anything much more than just damaging a couple wires. I don't think it'll even take out machines, but I obviously haven't tested it because lots of resources involved in testing an explosion. The thing with nuclear reactors is that, and this is something you can find on any tutorial on building reactors anywhere, I don't intend to go into too much detail here, is that they've got a lot of cooling things that happen to them. Effectively, within a 5x5 square, if it reaches a certain heat, all water evaporates. So you want to make this actually really high, so that, see, this is, the middle is 1, or the middle is, see, the ground is 1, this is 2, this is 3, that's 4, and then this is 5. And so at 5, if water is going to evaporate. So what do? We go to 6, which is this one right here. And then we fill in the ceiling, and you're going to be doing this with water buckets. Of course, you don't have creative mode, but then just get water sources, and and fill the whole thing up with water. This is going to cool the reactor down, so basically it requires less ice, which is really an important thing, because if you're not using ice for cooling the reactor, then you're going to be using ice for other more important things. So then, i.e., well, not more important than cooling the reactor, but you're going to be using them in your recycler to power the mass fab. And so then what you want to do is you want to just add a new pneumatic tube, and now whenever this machine is on, it's going to see that reactor as a valid destination, and it's just going to fill it up with ice. There's two more things that we need to do for this. The first is to make a way for the power to come out of it. So for this, you actually need high voltage cable. You can't use glass fiber. If you use glass fiber, it's going to melt and bad stuff's going to happen. Then you need an HV transformer to turn it into something other than HV. And so then you go in here. Excuse me. It seems to be a little troublesome. There we go. And you don't want that HV cable running too far, because if you, it's very, very low, it's high waste, basically. The more of the high voltage cable you're running, the less EU you have in total. And you also want to make sure that that side, the 3 side, is going to be facing the high voltage cable. So in that case, you have to go like this. Give me a sec here. And see, that right there shows that the high voltage cable is facing the reactor. And seal that back up. And then from here, you can just use standard glass fiber cable running over to the rest of your machine. So glass fiber cable, yada yada, goes all the way over here. And connects there. So C is running directly into our mass fab, so the mass fab is going to be charged all the time. And then over here, it's going to, when the mass fab's not demanding energy, as it always is, it's going to fill up the MFSU. And the MFSU is going to charge all our things, so we are not restricted to any amount of energy per tick. The last thing you want is a way to turn the reactor off if something goes horribly wrong. So what we're going to do is we're going to use two things. One, a thermal monitor, and two, red alloy wire. A thermal monitor is very simple. Basically, you click on this. You tell it what heat at which to shut off the reactor, or what heat at which to emit a redstone signal. That's what this thing does. When the reactor reaches that heat, it outputs a redstone signal. And then the nice thing about a redstone signal is that if you apply a redstone signal to any part of a reactor, the reactor automatically shuts down. And so we take this, we run a redstone wire in there, and now when it's over 6,000 heat, as seen by this thermal monitor here, the reactor will shut down because it is now receiving a redstone signal. So all that's left is to turn this machine on, let it fill up with ice, and then throw a metric boatload of uranium cells into it. You can still reach it through this side over here. Not the most convenient way of accessing it, maybe, but it is It's the easiest way to access it while still keeping the other sides for what we intend them to be used for. And so let's get ice. See, ice flows into the reactor, and the reactor is going to be happy. Then we just have to configure these. Remember that you want the uranium cells to be as next to each other as possible. If they are right next to each other, they're going to be pulsing more, and then they're going to be producing more power, basically. And then see, these are filling up with ice. The reactor fills up with ice pretty quickly. Note that ice will only be taken down once per stack, so you need as many stacks in there as you feel comfortable with, basically. But if you wanted to, you could put more uranium into this thing. I could put another row this way and then another row this way if I wanted it producing a lot of power. But as you can see, that your reactor is producing power now, and so the mass fabricator is moving very, very quickly, even without any scrap in it. We have to wait for the reactor to fill up before scrap starts getting sent to the recyclers again, but I'll just magic up some scrap to show you guys how fast it moves now. But see, when you throw in scrap, look at that. Is that not the most beautiful thing you have ever seen? Is that progress bar not amazing? And see, this reactor right here, it's only operating at like half speed. You could throw in twice as many uranium cells and the thing would still be stable. It's just ridiculous. This right here is the best setup for a nuclear reactor, because the singularity compressors only use like 1 EU per tick once they're fully spun up. And I mean, you could power all of these things with a single MV solar. All of it would just stay on all the time, and the reactor, all of its output would then go to the mass fabricator, which is just amazing. It's like, look at that. It's the best thing ever. In one single machine, you not only have a lot of material to send to your mass fabricator, or your recyclers rather, but you also have a completely stable or you also have a completely stable nuclear reactor which will never overheat so long as you have these timers running. And even if you don't have those timers running, even if something goes catastrophically wrong, you've got this thermal sensor over here which turns the machine off if it reaches 6,000 heat. It's completely and utterly stable. The only reason you'd go with something other than this is if you were going for a breeder type reactor, but you know, we'll get into that later. There's another way of running this, actually. There's something called the MFFS kit, which is basically a couple of reactor-specific things. How to explain it? Basically, it's force fields. Force fields to protect the reactor makes it completely immune to any form of explosion whatsoever. And then there's a heat monitor, which will actually allow you to keep it at a specific heat instead of just filling it up with ice and keeping it constantly at 0. The problem that I notice with those is that the heat sensor, the heat manager, all the ice that you throw in it only takes off 100 heat per ice. And I think that you can actually get more heat out of throwing ice into the reactor directly. I don't know, don't quote me on that, I haven't decompiled the code. But this is pretty much the simplest setup for a completely stable reactor which outputs over 1,000 EU per tick. And it's just amazingly useful. Solves all your problems. Even for this, you probably need more than 2 recyclers, max overclocked recyclers. But, I'll leave that up to you. Feel free to mess around with this design as much as you want, but this is the basic configuration that you would go with for basically your introduction to really, really high output power.